everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the animal kingdom and man's role in it. Is man truly the most superior? This is a good question to contemplate. So today I'm going to be discussing this with my guest, Christine Webb. She is a primatologist, and we're going to find out what that means. And she's the author of a book with a very intriguing title called The Arrogant Ape: The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. So let's get right into the discussion. Thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Christine, what is a primatologist? Let's start there.
Okay. It's actually primatologist. So,
like okay, that makes more sense.
Mm-hmm. And primatologists study other primates, so our closest living primate relatives, chimpanzees, bonobos, capuchin monkeys, and some primatologists are really interested in questions about human evolution because human beings are also primates.
Mm-hmm. How did you get into that? Field of study.
Yeah, so Jane Goodall, obviously a cultural icon, who many women, I think, are primatologists today because of her legacy and example. Actually, primatology is one of the few natural science disciplines that's dominated by women, and I think it's in no small part due to her and other women primatologists like Dian Griesel, who had quite a reputation. But I got into primatology, I would say it starts very early on with my love for other animals and the great outdoors. And when I entered high school, I started learning about evolutionary theory, and I actually was captivated by Darwin's On the Origin of Species. I read it from cover to cover, and I didn't read many of the books I was assigned to read in high school, so that was pretty telling. And if you combine that love of other animals with an interest in evolution, I think you can kind of get to primatology because these are animals who they straddle this supposed divide between human and animal, and they're really interesting for asking evolutionary questions. And then the last thing I'll say is I just had an amazing opportunity to work with a primatologist named Frans as an undergraduate, and it was his mentorship and again the influence of other primatologists like Jane Goodall that showed me this could actually be a career path.
You know, it's so funny you mentioned, you triggered two thoughts for me. One, when the internet first came out, when people would search my name or I would search my name, they would always say, do you come up right next to Dian Griesel? I'm like, oh, that was interesting. I don't know why, but it happened every time.
Yeah.
The second thing that was kind of funny that you reminded me of, talking about Darwin. I grew up in a very Catholic household. My parents were very involved with the local church, fundraising and doing different things. And I had to go to catechism, once a week. And my catechism teacher one year was actually my godmother. And I came home in tears one day and I said, Mom, I'm not sure you want me going to catechism anymore. The teacher today told us that we were descendants from apes and that we evolved from apes. And I went first or second grade, and this was a concept I was not ready to go for.
That's so interesting because in some ways, for me, when I learned about that very kinship, I loved that. It gave this sense of a kind of scientific authority to that sense of interconnection that I had felt with other animals. And it's also really important to emphasize, because it relates to questions about human exceptionalism and human superiority, which I'm sure we'll get into, that actually we did not evolve from or descend from apes or monkeys. We actually share a common ancestor with them who lived around 5 to 7 million years ago. And those other primates have continued to evolve in parallel to us. So chimpanzees and bonobos are equally evolved as human beings are. We just share a common ancestor with them. who, and we're not sure, exactly what they look like or who they were more like necessarily. So that's an important clarification, because I think we often assume that these other animals stayed the same and we just continued to progress and evolve. But that's captured in a lot of evolutionary images too, of this like hunched over ape that eventuates in an upright human being or Homo sapiens. But that's a very distorted and narrow view of evolution. It's much more like a tree, and not just one particular branch.
I think this episode can end right there, and it's not going to. But right there, that's such a distinction that I don't think I've ever actually heard someone describe so articulately as you just did.
No, it's such a common misconception. I mean, I taught primatology classes at Harvard for a number of years, and many of the evolutionary biology students come into that classroom with this notion, and it's because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture and even in our scientific illustrations and metaphors that we often take it for granted.
Now, how do you think man does fit on the evolutionary food chain as compared to animals and the hierarchy of the animal kingdom?
Yeah, well, food chains are an interesting place to start, because most ecologists would say that we don't live in a food chain, we actually live in a food web. So a food chain implies a hierarchy, and where you have, apex predators who have control over prey, but a food web emphasizes that there's a bidirectionality to this relationship, that even prey can exercise sort of power over predators. And because there's only so many of us around, there's only so many prey, there's only so many predators, and they can have constraints on each other. So food webs are really, I think, important for rethinking hierarchical ideas and metaphors once again. Human exceptionalism is this concept that I grapple with in the book, and I define it as the belief that humans are somehow separate from and superior to the rest of nature. Now, for a long time, we didn't even put human beings in food chains or food webs, which I think is a testament to this first part of the story, that somehow we're separate from, we are a different entity altogether than the rest of nature. And then there's this superiority claim, which is completely counter to how we know evolution works. So if you look at some of Darwin's original writing, he's often quoted with this famous phrase that differences between species are a matter of degree and not kind. So there are not these categorical differences amongst species. And he was not just referring to evolutionary continuity in biology or in physical form. He was referring to evolutionary continuity in psychology, in the makeup of our minds. And I think one of the main reasons for this belief in human exceptionalism has to do with privileging of the human mind, our intelligence, our consciousness, our capacity to innovate, all of these psychological feats that we cherish in our own species. But what Darwin argued and showed very convincingly is that there's continuity in both biological and psychological mechanisms. And so strictly from a scientific point of view, human exceptionalism is unsound. It's unfounded.
One of the things that popped into my head very randomly, as a lot of thoughts do, when I read your book title, and now even more so speaking with you, was love. Because when you think of how love expands, and you absolutely see it in animals, and in a very interesting way, and I'm not a pet owner, but if I was going to say I have a social media feed, it's filled with animals and babies laughing. Because each change of day, watch a baby laugh. Or an animal just do something so loving, which I think of hierarchy a lot in that way. I mean, what is the highest thing you could aspire to be? A loving force. So it's something I was thinking about when I was contemplating interviewing you.
Yeah, well, and this is the thing about hierarchies. It all depends on who's setting them. Who gets to decide what counts as the ultimate feat or capacity? Is it the capacity for rationality and reason, as you know, Descartes and many influential Western philosophers have maintained, or is it the capacity for love? Is it intuition? Is it all of these other abilities that we've long said separated us from other animals? So for a long time it was reason or rationality or language, and then it was things like self-awareness or tool use or empathy or even artistic sensibilities, and one by one all of these hypotheses for human uniqueness have been refuted. And as scientists, we should ask, okay, well, at what point then do we just say that the hypothesis itself is wrong? Like, good scientists at some point should abandon a hypothesis if it's not proving to be true. And I think love is such an interesting one, because you're right that in many, spiritual and cultural spaces, love is considered to be like the ultimate capacity, and also the ultimate thing that binds us and connects us all together, coming back to the kind of evolutionary story.
And you see humans start to rationalize love or explain it, or excuse it, or dismiss it. We get our rational mind involved, whereas where people, will talk about their dog greeting them at home. You're like, I just love my dog. It always greets me with the same amount of love every single time.
Yeah, and there's something that is inexplicable about it, that it can't be distilled into language. It's ineffable. And that there is such a power there that I think we would do well to embrace more, as opposed to try to explain, like embrace the mystery of it, and that we can't fully comprehend it, but that it's something that we intuit and experience with each other and with many other forms of life. And I do think there's something really powerful about other species bringing that out in us even more, because of radical differences in our ways of being. Again, it's not to rank these differences, but to say that, okay, a dog's way of perceiving the world is completely different from our own. And that brings us to a place where we have to connect on these deeper, more authentic levels. And I think that there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because you also mentioned, creativity and artistry. And I love taking early morning walks and finding, whether I'm in New York or whether I'm in some, wooded place, because I love the spider webs that you see, the morning dew on a spider web. And I can just, or you look at a bird's nest and you say, I took sewing lessons for a lot of years when I was younger. I don't think I could ever make a bird's nest. That's an art form. Now you can look at the George Washington Bridge. I'm in New York City. I see that regularly. And that's an art form. But so is that nest.
Completely. And I think we've had an unfortunate tendency of explaining these constructions like spider webs and birds' nests as being instinctive and automatic, and because of that we've taken away all of this sort of like cognitive ingenuity that is required. It's like, oh no, this is just what these animals do, they're programmed to do it. But actually when you look, and there's an amazing researcher at the University of St. Andrews who's studying bird nest construction and showing that there are pronounced individual differences in how nests are constructed, that they're not constructed according to like a specific blueprint every time, but that individual birds will construct different kinds of nests. They'll use different materials to do so. So there's absolutely creativity involved there. And I would imagine the same is true for spiders' webs. And bird song is another really interesting one I write about in the book, where when birds sing, and it's often male birds who are singing to court female birds, we had this understanding that it's it's fixed, it's innate, that they don't have much control over it. It's something they learn, when they're before they've even hatched, and that they just repeat sounds that they've heard. But one of the defining features of songbirds' songs is that they are learned. And so they're not all the same. And they are incredibly complex, actually far more complex than what the human ear can detect. Like if you slow down bird song, you hear an incredible acoustic richness that is far beyond our own hearing. And even without that, I think many of us can appreciate that there's so much diversity and nuance there. And then the one last thing I want to say about birdsong, which is related in some ways to this conversation about bias, is that evolutionary biology often approached birdsong as like, okay, well, it's purely competition. It's just males competing with one another for females. Like, and so if you hear birdsong, you can kind of reduce it to this instinctive behavior that's just meant to attract females. But it reminds me of this question of love again, because sure, you could explain it on the basis of male-male competition and males competing with other males aggressively for females, but you could also explain it as this male expressing his love and his interest towards the female. And that's a more cooperative explanation. And we know that evolution is both competitive and cooperative. And unfortunately, we've tended to emphasize the former view, the hierarchical view, rather than the equally important symbiotic view.
Well, it's funny you say all that because years ago there was something probably going around on the internet, it's probably still there, and it was two different praying mantises competing for the attention, so using the word compete, for the attention of the female praying mantis. And I remember thinking, gee, if I was a praying mantis, I know exactly which one I'd want to go with. Because there was something, it wasn't aggressive. It was like this dance, but it was more like the tango in a way, versus it had this sensuality to this praying mantis dance. It was really adorable.
I haven't seen that, I must say, but courtship rituals are very elaborate. I mean, and they're there precisely to manage and mitigate competition. They're there to have an alternative means of, vying for the love interest of this other individual, and not necessarily killing each other or harming each other in the process. I mean, sometimes it involves that, but it's not a rule. It's not necessary. There's again so many different ways of being intelligent in nature, and I think that is such an important point that I'm trying to make in this book, is that intelligence can manifest in so many different ways, and if we only take a particular, let's say, human way, or even a more narrow version of that, like a particular human cultural way of being intelligent, then we're stacking the deck from the start against other ways of being intelligent, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. When you look at the intertwine, how you need bees for this, but everything is so a web, as you were talking about before. There's this web of interconnectivity. How do you think humans slip on the hierarchy and maybe lose that top position? What are some ways that you've observed?
Well, I think it's spend a couple minutes.
As the praying mantis, maybe.
I mean, unfortunately today, all you have to do is turn on the news, and you'll get a lot of evidence for the ways that human behavior is not necessarily so intelligent, and not necessarily acting according to these interdependent principles that would lead to a more healthy balance between not just different human cultures, but between humans and the rest of nature. So one of the main arguments in the book is that this belief in human exceptionalism, this belief that humans are separate from and superior to the rest of nature, is at the root of the ecological crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And that unlike the other diverse causes of the ecological crisis, like fossil fuels or overconsumption or habitat loss, human exceptionalism is rarely named or studied. It's not something that we identify and scrutinize in the way that we study these other causes and recognize them. And in this way, it kind of operates in this more invisible way. And I say that it's the most powerful unspoken belief of our time. And so I think, the main way in which human exceptionalism kind of fails us is in the way that it orients us towards each other, because there's also a history of humans considering many human groups to be subhuman or not fully human at all. So it influences how we relate to other, who gets to count as fully human and have fully human attributes, and also in beyond our species and how we treat the living world. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were getting at with this question of where we slip. But it's the way that I approach kind of the pitfalls of this worldview, and why it seems so urgent today to see past it.
No, that was a very interesting answer. One of the things, I always wish they weren't in cages, but I do love going to the Central Park Zoo and watching the primates, the monkeys, run around, and the hierarchy that happens in that environment.
It kind of goes back to this point about courtship rituals, and how dominance hierarchies are there in part to help animals avoid conflicts. So you'll have potentially monopolizable resources, especially at zoos, because they're provisioned with food. So like they'll get thrown a big pile of food, and then rather than duking it out, who gets to eat what, and fighting and becoming exhausted and expending all of this energy and potentially risking injury to allocate those resources, dominance hierarchies in part function to help avoid that. And so that some individuals will get priority access, but other individuals will eventually get access. And zoos are a very complicated scenario, because I think the zookeepers will make sure that every individual gets some food. But it's not to say that dominance hierarchies don't exist in nature, or that they're somehow morally wrong. I mean, human exceptionalism is a moral hierarchy. It is so much more expansive in scope. It's not just determining like who gets access to certain kinds of foods, but it's determining so much of our behavior on this planet, from habitats to clean and air and water. I mean, it's just so much more powerful in scope, and it's also something that we know is culturally learned and not necessarily biological. So we might argue that some kind of hierarchical orientations, because we see them in our closest living primate relatives, although just to say that like in chimpanzees, we have like these male dominance hierarchies, and bonobos, there's female dominance hierarchies. So there's not like one particular hierarchical formation that is our evolutionary heritage. But we can still, even if we say that dominance hierarchies are something we see in nature, and that we're kind of oriented towards having dominance hierarchies, that's not to say that we're human exceptionalists by nature, because actually there are many human cultures around the world today, and also in the past, who have not subscribed to the worldview of human exceptionalism. And in fact, it's not the worldview that young human children come into the world wearing or having. It's not the lens that they come into the world with. It's something that they learn as they gain more exposure to and contact with the dominant culture. So that's kind of how I think about this maybe propensity towards hierarchies. it doesn't necessarily make it a part of human nature, and it doesn't always manifest in the same way across cultures.
That's very interesting. I'm curious, when you started writing your book, it's a twofold question, but I'll ask it in two parts. Um, did you have your title before you started writing the book, or did the title come after you finished it?
It came before, and actually my mom came up with it.
Oh,
So I was teaching a class at Harvard in the human evolutionary biology department, and I knew I wanted to teach a class about these issues, this topic, the kind of hubris of the modern human condition. And we were throwing back and forth different title options, and she said The Arrogant Ape, and I was like, okay, that's definitely the name of the class, and it sounds like a really good book title too. I knew I wanted to teach the class, and I was thinking about writing a book, and as soon as she said those words, I thought, that sounds right.
now as you drilled down and started writing this book, and you really start researching more, a book's a very time-consuming, energy, focus. Did you find you were teaching yourself in the process and finding new things that you really hadn't thought about, but as you got an idea in your head and said, whoa, before I put that down, this is going to go down in pages, Harvard's going to know about it, I want to make sure I dig down deeper in this?
Definitely. This is one of the best parts about writing. I mean, it really forces you to think deeply and carefully about these ideas. And teaching Harvard students, especially, they don't let you get away with much. They ask amazing questions. And so you learn to anticipate what kinds of questions and issues an audience might have with what you're saying. One of the best examples, though, of I think this process you're describing is coming back to this word, primate. So I am a primatologist. I've written that word, primate, primatologist, countless times a day. I say it all the time. And I did not realize until writing this book what its deeper significance is. So primate comes from the Latin primata, which means of the first rank. So this hierarchical view is embedded even in the word that we use to designate our own taxonomic group. And I had no idea. And I say it all the time. And now that I know it, it makes so much sense because, we have words like primacy and primary. But I had never made that link before. But I find it was those kinds of things that I found most interesting. And I'm still on this perpetual journey of learning or unlearning all the ways that human exceptionalism has seeped into our society, into our language, into our science. I mean, it's a perpetual unlearning curve, as I like to say.
That's a great phrase for a next question. What do you think we as humans need to unlearn for a better to own our positioning in the hierarchy? What do we have to unlearn or accept or embrace?
I think there's so many different ways I could go here, but just one is again the way that evolution works, the way that we might think it works, but the way that it actually works as being not progressive. It doesn't culminate in us. Understanding that it relies equally on competition as it does on cooperation, and that there's so many different ways of being successful evolutionarily. So as a specific example here, you often hear people talk about how humans are the most evolutionarily advanced or complex organism. And that's based on a particular measure in evolution that looks at, okay, our ability to survive all around the world in all sorts of different habitats and landscapes. We've managed to spread out all over the earth and survive. And that is seen as evidence of our evolutionary success. But other organisms have very different ways of being successful. So let's think about mosses. The indigenous botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer writes a lot about mosses, and It's another interesting point about language because I think there's over 16,000 species of moss, and we have only one word for them. And mosses have been around for 500 million years, several hundred million years, and human beings have only been around for 200,000 years, give or take. And mosses have managed to survive for so many millions of years because of very low competitive ability. So rather than competing with their surroundings, they actually survive by creating these very interconnected interspecies communities. They're, funneling water into the soil, into tree roots. They're helping other organisms with photosynthesis. Like there's so many things that they're doing to create these flourishing interspecies networks and communities. And that's how they've managed to live for so many years. And so what if instead of measuring evolutionary success by something like ecological dominance, which is how we define it and measure it, because that's what humans do, what if we measured and defined evolutionary success by the ability to cooperate with other forms of life, to contribute, exactly, and to have longevity and be resilient over millions and millions of years? I mean, the way that things are looking right now, human beings, or at least as we know them today, like, we're not going to survive the ecological crisis. It's going to be an incredibly, we're creating the circumstances on this planet, not for all life to disappear, but we're creating the circumstances that would make it very, very difficult for human beings to survive and flourish. And so how can we see that trajectory as evidence of evolutionary success? I don't agree with that. I think there are many different ways of understanding what it means to be evolutionarily successful. And so I think this is, again, coming back to this main theme, or what humans would need to unlearn to put us in the right place and to bring us down to earth, is that when we measure the world with a ruler that is made for humans or made by humans, other species, other forms of life are inevitably going to come up short. But if we can move beyond that human-centric way of thinking and being, we can learn so much from other forms of life who've navigated evolutionary deep time and difficult ecological circumstances with great resourcefulness and ingenuity. And we have a lot to learn right now, I think, from those other beings.
And from your book.
Hopefully. I hope people read my book and then use that as their bridge to start learning from other species, because that was my experience. I learned all this. I learned much of this from other species and then put it into a book for our own species.
Oh my gosh, these episodes always go too fast, Christine, and I can't tell. You've got some lucky students. I enjoyed this tremendously, and your book is very thought-provoking, and I really want to thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Don't hang up, Christine. We're going to move over to the green room. Everybody, I'm Dian Griesel. This has been the Silver Disobedience Perception Dynamics podcast, and I've been speaking with Christine Webb, and there are going to be links to her book, to all kinds of ways you can get in touch with her below this episode, and I highly recommend you follow her and share this. It's a very thought-provoking episode about, are we humans really at the top of the, what would we call it, Christine? The top of the hierarchy?
Evolutionary pyramid, sure.
Evolutionary pyramid. This really was thought-provoking in great ways. So please hit subscribe, order Christine's book, follow this, and stay in touch, everybody. Thank you, Christine, for joining me.
Thanks again.